Assuming you've got not. But we'll work it out at the end of this. Okay, so here we go. Well done, everyone, for coming to this, the latest session. It's the third one that I've delivered, but it's in week 5 of your autumn semester of your final year, about the research dissertation. And where we're at in terms of the process is here. We've talked about generally how might one approach the doing and the development of your dissertation. And in week 2 we looked at literature review and methodology. And the intervening weeks, in weeks 3 and 4, you've been thinking about your status, and everyone's going to be really different. Some people will have done a literature review way back before we did the lecture on it. Some people will have completed their data collection by the time they came back from the summer. Some people are only starting it at that stage, and all that is completely fine. But it was really important that you engaged with your own situation and worked up a body of work alongside your supervisor, a timetable for work, to make sure that as we approach where we're at about now, then you will have done some certain things. You've got a plan to do things if you've not quite completed them, and you don't feel as if you're just running to catch up by this stage in the semester. So we're coming then this week to think about our empirical analysis, how we might deal with our data and how we might write up that stuff before you have a reading week next week, and then follow through the remainder of the semester. And I'll come back to what we're doing in the remainder of the semester right at the end of today's slot. So where should we be at approximately this time in the semester? So you should have at least met with your supervisor. I know some people are having some problems. If anybody has having any problems you've not let me know about, then again, maybe talk to me afterwards. Okay, so make sure we can iron those problems out for you. So if there is a problem, let a whole range of people know. There's me, but you have a personal tutor, you have a course director. Their job, what they're there for, what they were put on this planet for, is to support you through this process. Okay, so please don't suffer in silence. Please don't think this problem is going to go away. We're getting to the point at which we need to address it, because we might even be thinking about extensions and all that sort of thing in order that you get your stuff done. We don't want you to trip up in this process. So all the school's resources will be there to support you, but you need to let us know. Okay, that's your part of the bargain, if you like. Through that engagement with your supervisor, you'll have a timetable of work broadly put in mind. Where were you at in relation to your data collection, in relation to your literature review? Some people, and some of my supervisors, have given me a version of their literature review, for example, and got initial comments back on it. Some people are working on their methodology chapters, and either are about to give them in, got a plan to give them in a couple of weeks' time, etc., etc. But it's a conversation, it's an active engagement on your part and on your supervisor's part to work out how all these things are working through. Some people will have completely finished their data collection. Some people have a few odds and sods to tidy up and might be using reading week to that end. Or some people are thinking, okay, thank goodness for reading week, because that's the time I'm going to nail all my data collection. Again, it doesn't really matter where you are in this process, so don't beat yourself up about it. As long as you have a plan, as long as you have momentum, because there's still time to get all this done. You just need to consider how this fits alongside any other credit-bearing modules that you're taking in this semester. Some people just have one module, some people will have 2 modules, and if you've got 2 modules, then clearly you're going to be juggling other assessed work more than someone who's just doing 50 credits this semester. So you need to actively engage with your time management, understand your own skills and your weaknesses, understand what other jobs you might have, other social commitments, etc., and make sure you have a plan. Okay. So this is where broadly we should be. And as we approach reading week and the absence of, perhaps actively being in the school, maybe you're going home, maybe you're doing something different for reading week, I'd just like to take this opportunity to remind you of the resources that have been put together to support your dissertation even when you're not actively here. Okay? So if we click on that first YouTube link, then there's a whole range of dissertation writing, dissertation advice. There's stuff about your writing your dissertation analysis, for example. If you're thinking, what did he say about methodology the other time? Then you can click on the one, just a couple of minutes about the methodology chapter that will hopefully keep you on the straight and narrow. This is just, if you go onto YouTube and just search for the school's YouTube page, then you will find this under the skills not what you think it is. Okay? Similarly, there's things that publishers have put together, and for the Sage publishers website, which is the next link on the slide, and these ones I happen to have stopped on because they relate to the things that we're doing today, about returning to your research questions as you start your write-up, have an overriding argument. Sort of experts in the field from across the country have given a whole range of advice podcasts that go along with that Doing Your Human Geography dissertation book that Kimberly Peters, who used to be you way back in the day, has written based on her own experiences and her own experiences of supervising students through their human geography dissertation. So a whole range of resources that are there to support you even when you're not actually here. Okay, so we turn to what we're going to do about our analysis, our empirical materials, our write-up. If we remember back, then we might have an introduction chapter, a lit review chapter, a methodology chapter, and then our empirical analysis and our conclusions. Broadly speaking, your empirical analysis therefore follows your methodology, and we're kind of doing it in a chronological order through the lectures that go along this, and you might have 1, 2, or maybe even 3 empirical chapters that engage with the data that you have collected through your study. So the purpose of these chapters is to effectively interpret, translate, produce, construct something valuable from the ocean of data that you've collected. Some of you I know have just got 350 survey responses. What am I supposed to do with that? I've ended up doing 3 focus groups, 20 interviews. I've got all this documentary material, and it's just sitting there, this great big lump on my desk, materially or metaphorically, going, how on earth do I engage with that? It's your job, therefore, to engage with this massive data and turn this raw data into something that people understand. That it's like you've got a lump of clay and you're making it into a ashtray, or all this music and you're trying to make a thing, or an ingredient to make a nice Mary Berry cake, whatever. You're trying to construct an argument. You've got to consider yourself as an active agent in this process, and you are moulding, you are shaping, you are scoping, you are deciding what's in and what's out. What should I include? What isn't? What can I exclude? What can I evidence? What order should I put all this stuff in order to make a coherent argument to persuade my reader about the purpose of my dissertation, the importance, the significance of your dissertation? You're clearly wholly committed to it. You think these are important, these questions are important, that's why you engage with them. Your respondents think they're important, that's why they gave you their time to talk about it. So you must have a responsibility to all this pile of raw data that's kind of sitting in your computer. Okay, I've got to translate these into chapters, engage with my literature review, answer my questions, and produce an argument that is going to convince my reader of the importance and significance of my issue. Okay. So broadly speaking, this is what the empirical analysis does. It's this process of putting this stuff through an analytical machine, i.e. you, and producing an argument, a clear, coherent argument you can walk someone through from this massive data that you've produced. To help you do that, it's worth bearing in mind where you've been in your dissertation journey already. You've dealt with a whole mass of literature in the same type of way. Okay, and from that literature, maybe through the draft of your literature review, you've created a few key themes, a few key areas of literature with some key themes coming out of them. The point we'll return to, you think, okay, I've got to create a conversation between my raw data and the literature. Can I use those key points from the literature to help me begin this process of sifting this raw data? Similarly, you've used a particular type of methodology. You might have used a survey, you might have used a semi-structured interview questions, for example. In other words, your survey would have had questions in a particular order for a particular reason. Maybe you can turn back and have a conversation with your methodology and say, okay, well, questions 2 to 5, we're all dealing with this type of area, and questions 6 to 10, we're dealing with that type of area. Is that a working beginning point to to begin to deal with all this massive data and start putting it into chunks so it becomes slightly more manageable. So at least I can understand that data and start reflecting on what order I should create a journey through it. So we're kind of going, this beautiful diagram on, I'll come back to it. What I wanted to connect is when you get this conversation going with your literature, develop an idea, develop a theme, reflect back on your literature, reflect on your methodology, connect it back to your raw data. That raw data, connect again to the literature, back to your methodology and go forward. And before you know it, this massive data is becoming, you're kind of putting it out in a line and going, well, if I go there, then go there. It's a journey. It might be straight down the line. It might be down the characters. It almost doesn't matter. It's a process of changing this raw data into an argument in a particular way. And again, each of you will do that process differently. Even if I started and gave you all exactly the same raw material, the way you make that decision about how you scope what's important and what's not important, how you put it in a particular order, how you connect that to that to that, and then only then come back to this, or then go back to that point. You'll do this all completely differently, all of you. And that is fine. You just have to evidence, justify, and make clear why you're doing what you're doing, and can you back up the argument that you're making. So this is where this notion of being critical comes in. And we're going to go through that as we go through today's session, in order that this critical engagement in processing this data, in translating and interpreting this raw data into a finished product, allows you to get to the end and draw some conclusions. This is why this was important. This is why you spent a couple of hours of your time reading this. This is why these people engage with me, and I've spent 3 months of my life producing this stuff. Because there's clear outputs, there's policy recommendations, there's dreams for a better world, whatever it happens to be. There's direct answers to the questions that I set up through this engagement with your data. Okay. Structurally, just to remind you, I guess, if this was the order going through of your thesis, then the empirical chapters comes after the methodology. And you might have one big chapter with multiple sections inside it. You might have 2 chapters, you might have 3 chapters. I've always thought that dissertations tend to have 3 chapters, because dissertations tend to have 3 key questions they're seeking to answer. If you've got 2 key questions or even 1 key question, that's completely fine too. And your starter for 10, I would suggest, is if you've got 3 key questions and 1 chapter per question. That's a way you start divvying up your data. That's a straightforward, relatively crude mechanism for dealing with that great big raw ocean of data that you're just drowning in, potentially. And important to remember that dealing with that data connects back to the literature review and the methodology. Okay. So we're beginning to think about how we might structure your empirical chapters. As I've implied already, it comes down perhaps to how we might actually start dealing with that data. Change that huge amount of data that you've got into something that you can create A, B, C, D. Let me walk you through this straightforward argument. That question, therefore, of D is a process that has 2 parts, if you like. One is dealing with the data, and one is producing that data, displaying that data, presenting that data. In other words, structuring your dissertation. The matter of dealing with it perhaps turns into that structure. And you might have, these are the most popular ways of doing it. Okay, so firstly, as I've suggested, your chapters for your empirical materials relate directly to your research questions. Okay? And that, as we will see, is most obvious and most generally done if you're hypothesis testing. Not that many of you are doing that, to be honest with you, but it's a very popular way to do it if you're doing a very scientific question. I'm going to prove or disprove this hypothesis. Most of you will do the second one, and that will be from your raw material, you identify some key themes, and you group those themes together into particular chapters. And so that will be, I'll have as many chapters or as many sections as there are kind of key themes. But how many I should do it's a point that we'll come back to. Do you want 20 chapters? That's probably the third way of doing it, which is rather an old school way of doing it, that I know some members of staff kind of like and have done themselves, but if I'm honest, I don't know, would be simply presenting your data and then all in one big swoop and then commenting on it in a subsequent chapter. Okay? That way of doing things would again be quite a scientific approach and reminds me of when I did kind of science, integrated science at GCSE, and say, what I did when I put my biro inside a Bunsen burner was this happened. And then next following chapter, this is why this happened. So it's kind of like a presentation of results and then a comment of results subsequently. I think it's far better. Now, point number one, I suppose, is that every thesis is going to have the presentation of results and the comment of results in there somewhere. It's just how you put them together. Are you going to do one in one job lot and then comment on, you know when we said that then, this is why this happened. Why not, when I put my pen in a Bunsen burner and say, this is what happened, and then immediately after say, this is why it happened. So my analysis and my presentation of results is at the same moment. This effectively is what this second approach does. Okay? Is that you present, you analyse at the same time. You make your point, you connect it, perhaps, or you explain it, why it's going on. You might, through that explanation, connect it back to the literature review. Because you know we said in the literature review that this person said that, I don't know, youth cultures do X, Y, and Z. Well, this is what we're seeing happening here. That's what that quotation outlines. And then that explanation connects to the next point that your respondents say. And before you know it, you're building up this conversation. Not this kind of stilted, this is there and this is there, which this approach tends to go to. It's completely fine, but I think that always comes across much more strongly. If you can create an argument that connects your empirical back to your literature review. Okay, all good so far? Okay, so I want to do a few slides simply about how you start dealing with this massive raw data that you've created and with what the insights so far about how might one structure their empirical chapters move to making that real, realising that in practice. So, you will all have a range of different empirical data that you're going on. Some will have all of these, some will have just one of them, and it really doesn't matter. But just to remind ourselves, we've got a range of secondary, primary, quant and qual data. We might have secondary data in terms of grey materials, policy documents, surveys, interviews, and indeed interviews in audio files. But is that the best way to have them? Do we need to transcribe them? And indeed ethnographic diaries and kind of notes, etc., etc. I think the first kind of point, the answer to the question how to deal with all this stuff, it can be really daunting. And it's not just daunting for you, it's daunting every time I start a new research project or at that end of your data collection. You think, crikey, I don't know, any project, we did this project with the Countryside Alliance, had 5,000 interview responses. Some project with environmental activists had 30 or 40 semi-structured interviews that have got to be transcribed and they're analysed and coded and all that sort of stuff. This recent project on the Literary Atlas, hence the moment, with 580 books, all geocoded, all the locations in them, and interviewed kind of dozens of authors and artists and all this sort of stuff. And you're going, I've just got a mountain or an ocean or any big physical geography metaphor of stuff I've now got to deal with. How on earth do you do that? First way to do it, okay, you need data in a form that you can work with. And again, there's no right or wrong answer in this, but most of us use computers. Kind of gone are the days we have things out on paper and we're kind of highlighting and cutting and gluing them together in one big document. For your purposes, I think the basic spreadsheets, the basic documents of Word or word processing packages, XLS, SPSS for those of you using surveys, etc., are the ones you're going to need. Okay? There are other software packages out there, like Envivo, that help us collate and sort data. Effectively, Envivo is just a really, really posh version of a Word file, and it will take you a day to learn it, and in that day you could have done lots of stuff with Word that's going to get you to exactly the same place anyway. So let's say we're dealing with interviews. First of all, you can't really deal with an interview if it's not typed up. So you're going to need to transcribe it, okay? what does this transcription process involve? A lot of time, unfortunately. If you're doing, for me, it takes about 4 hours for me to type up a 1 hour interview. Okay? That makes me think, do I really need to type up everything? Because the less I type up, the lot shorter it's going to take me, purely practically. Okay? So do I want to type up that first 10 minutes where we were talking about what a lovely dog they have and the weather and the rugby and all that sort of stuff? Probably not. It's not essential that the small talk is typed up. You may well wish to listen to it back at the moment at which you're typing. You may just wish to go for a jog, and instead of listening to your power striding music, listen back to your interview transcription and just becoming literate on it, reminding yourself of what you spoke about, because I bet there's stuff, even if you were taking rough notes at the time, there's stuff in there that you will have forgotten or you didn't notice that first time. That thought, oh, that's a really good quote, and you're striding through the park and you're like, I should write that down or something. The point is you're just getting a kind of subliminal literacy about your data as you listen to it back, however you're doing it, the moment which you're transcribing, which I think is a good thing. Therefore, when you do come to actually transcribe it, you can almost know, I'm definitely using that quotation, and I'm definitely using that quotation, so I'll listen to all that, but those are the bits I'm typing. Okay? So you're making informed decisions about your time, the quality of your data, and what you really need transcription. Because wouldn't it be really lovely if you only transcribed the bits that you're really going to lift up and put into your argument later on, so you didn't have a lot of extraneous guff that you thought was really important, but really was the equivalent of small talk. Okay? It's a very difficult process to know precisely what you're going to need later on, so you have to make an informed judgment about it. But if you end up only transcribing 50% of your interviews or your focus groups, that is completely fine. Okay? But you have to kind of make sure that you're not casting aside really important stuff. So if in doubt, transcribe it for subsequent analysis, but make sure you're not transcribing. Okay? So what we're really doing is getting the data in a form we can work with. And that's exactly the same process if we're doing a survey. I know one of the guys... Oh,
I was going to ask, do you have to include your transcription?
You don't.
Or not? So you could just hit the quotes from it, and the actual original transcribed interview doesn't even need to be in there.
Doesn't need to be in there. Okay? Now, that's not saying you can't. Okay? So if you've transcribed it now, and only now he tells me, right? So that you can put it in, but you don't want it to count to your word count, because it would nuke your word count. Okay? So you put it in an appendix. Okay, for anybody who's using any form of transcription, I would put a note in your methodology, or the first point at which you enter a quotation in your empirical chapter, there's a little footnote and saying full transcriptions or full audio recordings, fully anonymised, are available from the author. Okay, if they're in the appendix, because you put them in, because you transcribe them all, just say full transcription could be seen in the appendix. Okay, it's not because every marker is going to want to read them, or indeed any marker is going to read them. Okay? The point is, if there's oh, that's so interesting, I must revisit that whole conversation because it sparks an idea, it's going to set in motion a new paradigm shift in human geography, then it's your job to put a little Hansel and Gretel little trail to where the reader can find that stuff and engage with it firsthand. Similarly, there's a follow-up saying, this is really odd, because the voice that's coming at me through this quotation is exactly the same voice as the author writing. I reckon this person might have made this up. How can I reassure myself that they've not? Well, I can look at the appendix, or I can email the author because they've told me that they've got their files on their computer somewhere, and that's fine. That's giving me a Hansel and Gretel trail to the source that I can look up. Okay? The second option, Javier. It's possible. That's why we're doing it, just to be as professional and as scholarly as we can. Any other questions about transcriptions and stuff? If you're minted, you can get someone to do it for you. Not many of us are in that position. And then you get all of it done. Okay, so you have to get all this material in a way that you can deal with it. And as I said, Word documents, spreadsheets, are the key way to do that. One of your cohort, as I was saying, had access to, I don't know, a huge data set. And his problem wasn't, his problem was the same in words as it in numbers, if you see what I mean. He's got so much stuff, he doesn't need all that stuff. He's got to sift. He's got to decide which bits are relevant and not relevant. And okay, I'll use the example, so probably won't be honest for those of you who know, but I'm sure you won't mind. So he was having kind of incidents on beaches across the whole of South Wales that are reported by the RNLI, the lifeguarding people. But he only wanted to do the Gower. So actually, it's a straightforward process. Well, I don't want Aberarthur. I don't want, I don't know, what's the Pembrey? I don't want all those ones that are not in the Gower. So simply, I get rid of those columns. It's this process of saying what's relevant and what's not relevant. Scoping your issues, saying, we talked about that, but I don't think that's relevant anymore. I'm not going to transcribe that bit, or whatever. Narrowing things down. So we've got a workable file, rather than a file with 300 different sheets. He can deal with 10 sheets, and suddenly it becomes something that you can do. So, as we engage with this first point of getting the data in a manageable form, then, okay, the next process of sifting, of sorting, of scoping, is how am I going to group this data together? How am I going to start cutting it up into chunks, or even what metaphor am I going to use to do this? And should I do it by type? Should I do all my secondary data together, all my surveys together, all my ethnographic data together? Shall I do it by the methodology, which I think I've just said, surveys or thing, or do I do it in primary or secondary? And I think the best way to do it is to go back to your original questions and think, okay, I started somewhere. I've left a little handsome gravel trail for myself. Probably in my ethical approval form, if not in my original research proposal. What did I originally think all those months ago that was really important in relation to my research? Can that give me a clue as to how I begin categorising and splitting up this big data? Okay. So, let's think about how we might, for all those different things, by data type, by theme, or by question, how we might go about structuring all the data, dealing with this data we've got. So let's deal with the surveys first. Who's done a survey? Just generally wave your hand around so I'm kind of thinking how many of us. So quite a lot, right? So as we've done those surveys, there might have been a reason why you put the questions in your survey the way that you did. And actually, that might be a very logical way to set up this sifting process. As I mentioned, questions 2 to 4 all deal with, I don't know, diet, and I might do the next questions all deal with attitudes to veganism, then they'll deal with attitudes to vegetarianism. Thinking, well, actually, diet, veganism, vegetarianism, there's my structure for my empirical chapters. It kind of makes sense. That might be an obvious, logical thing to do. It may well be, though, that actually the connections between question 3 and question 6 are far stronger than the connections between questions 2 and question 4. And so actually you think, I thought I was being really clever by pre-structuring my survey in this way, but actually my results suggest that there are internal connections, new connections that throw themselves up at me that I hadn't really noticed. And so I have to kind of put these in another way. A really obvious way in that is that probably on your surveys you will have got some personal data on there, are they male or female, etc., etc. Now, you're probably going to have to, two options here. Either you will have discussed that material in your methodology chapter, so it's all done and dusted, or it'll be one of the first things you do in your empirical chapters to say, who are my respondents? These are those people. Okay? Now that's probably not in the first question that you asked in your survey. It's probably one of the last ones, actually. So you think, actually, what I'm doing is, I'm bringing that and putting it forward, and then I'm dealing with all that, and then, what's the difference between males and females in relation to veganism or vegetarianism? That's the thing I need to do next. So it's this process of somewhat trial and error. It's this process of being literate of your data, reminding yourselves of your questions, the original questions, how those original questions informed your methodological choices, what data has been produced, and okay, what if I put those chunks of material there? Would that make sense? What would that leave me with? That would leave me with this, this, and this. Okay, well, if if I'm working on the assumption that this would work in this order, what happens if I brought that in next? And then what? Oh, that kind of does work, so I could do it in that way. Or actually, you made a bad decision just to get going, and you just have to go back, okay, put them all back into it and working it out. Sometimes this feels like doing a jigsaw without knowing the jigsaw box picture, okay? Which is really annoying, right? I'm going to spend 2 minutes talking about jigsaws now, just because I can, right? This has got me jigsaws for Christmas. How old am I? Not invalided in a hospital bed. Not only did she buy me jigsaws, not a present for me, a present for her, it was one of those jigsaw things that the picture on the front was 3 seconds before the thing that you're making. Right? So you think, okay, well there's a man doing that in this cartoon thing, doing that, and then, but what I'm making is not that picture. And you think the reason for that amazing anecdote into my life was that's a bit like this station. You're doing the jigsaw without the thing on the box gives you no clue. You haven't got a box. You haven't got a lid. You're making that lid as you go along. You're deciding which bits go where. Sometimes you just go, that's not working. I just have to disassemble it and put it back together again. But you're working on identifying what these kind of points, these key themes are going to be. From surveys, those themes are obviously they're going to generate, presumably, from your questions. You had a very structured survey, and each section might help with form a key question of your thesis. So can you group it together? If you've got those groups, you can then think, okay, if everything's about veganism, for example, then what little bits, veganism is quite a big topic, so which bits form that subject about veganism, and which bits, I think actually there's 3 components to that theme, which bit's going to go first? It's all a matter of identifying themes, thinking about how you're going to separate and sequence them. Well, separate your themes and then put them in a sequential order that makes sense. This, in effect, is what you're doing in a nutshell. So you're grouping it together and then putting it in 1, 2, 3. So, a bit of an example from a very statistical survey-oriented thing. I'm sure some of you, quite a lot of you are doing surveys, but not necessarily all of you are doing like chi-square tests. But here's an example for those of you who are. So, if you're looking at young people's voting patterns in the local elections in Newport, my key points are around kind of different hypotheses that I can broadly test. I'm separating out my data into key things that I can present and analyse that data in either 3 sections in one chapter or 3 separate chapters. Okay? And doing your analysis on them as you go. Most of you will be doing perhaps a connection between surveys and semi-structured interviews. And it's basically the same process, but it's just a little bit harder with interviews. It's a little bit harder because most of you will have been doing semi-structured interviews. In other words, your conversations didn't follow a strict linear structure of question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4 that your surveys undertook. So even if you had the foresight or the luck, or it just happened to go this way, that your surveys present you with a logical order to present your findings, semi-structured interviews often go question 1, question 6, question 5, question 4. So by the end you've got all the data, but it's all higgledy-piggledy. So you simply have to go through those transcriptions, often reading it on your computer, and then go, okay, that bit's talking about veganism, that bit's talking about vegetarianism, okay, I'll create a master file, right, with perhaps all my, and this is where it gets tricky, people. What I would do, right, and what things like In Vivo do for you, is you create a master file with a heading, everything about veganism, right? And I know I'm going to have a master file, everything about diet, veganism, and vegetarianism. So everything about veganism, or that from that point, in this interview transcript, there's that, cut, copy, that bit, cut, copy, that, cut, copy. And then from interview number 2, that, copy, paste, that, copy, paste, that, copy, paste, into this master file. Okay, so far, so straightforward. The problem I always have is, I forget the source of the quotation, because I put all the quotations into one big file and go, oh, where did that come from? And at some point, I have to connect the source to the original file, okay? How to do that? You could put things in different fonts, but when you copy and paste, they sometimes lose that. After every quotation, you can put, number 1, number 2, number 3, so every quotation you know which document it came from, or you just remember, or when you end up, and sometimes I like it, the final file, I find the quotation. So as I put in this, I think veganism is wunderbar. And I think, well, okay, there's only one person in my interviews who used the word wunderbar, so I'll just use File Manager to find the original source document and append the citation right at the end. Okay? You need to find a way that works for you. And if someone ever looks at your transcriptions and they don't match up, it's not a good thing. Okay, so that process of collating. Collate, great, straightforward, but remember the source. But again, what we're doing is from that great big mass of data, we're identifying key themes, master documents if you like, and pulling in material, right? And then once we've got one big master document about veganism, for the sake of argument, think, well, actually veganism is still, I've got, instead of one big huge ocean of data, I've just got a nice big Norwegian fjord of data, but it's still bloody big. How am I going to separate this up? So the vegan master document with all my different primary sources in it then gets actually veganism for those people who have done it since the day they were born, those people that have only done it in the last 3 years, males or females or something. Find ways in which to break down that Norwegian fjord of data into little rivers and streams to break it down again. What effectively we're doing is this same process. We might go back to our original questions to get an idea. What was this read about? I've kind of forgotten. Okay, this is what it's about. Are they still useful? Knowing my data, knowing either the survey, or in this case, knowing my transcriptions, and thinking, actually, yeah, I remember when we were talking about veganism or vegetarianism or young people's spatial practices or dance or whatever it happens to be, and we were talking about dance and we were thinking about dance in disability or dance and community building or dance and, I don't know, new forms of understanding of your body. I've got different themes being created. I think, okay, well, got to start somewhere. I'll start using those themes and start dragging and dropping materials together to create smaller documents. So this is, I don't know, you might be thinking about mind maps, you might be thinking about tree diagrams, whatever kind of works for you. Okay, I'll come back to this thing. So tree diagrams are probably like this. We've got a big theme that might be your whole thesis, and you're separating your thesis up into sub-themes, vegetarian, veganism, diet, and then underneath, smaller themes. You can think of these as quotes that inform the sub-theme, or actually these are even smaller sub-themes with quotes underneath them. Okay? One of the people in the cohort was doing stuff about young people and border spaces, and when they were doing their transcripts of focus groups in this case, they created 20 different themes. Okay? And at that stage, the thing, 20 different subjects of conversation that came up that they thought were relevant, that informed the overall title. And this is then the question, okay, at what level are those themes? Are they going to have 20 themes? Or actually, are they this level? If this is a tree diagram, are they trunks, are they branches, are they twigs, are they leaves? Extend the metaphor, right? And she basically decided that actually these were this level stuff, and what she needed to do, it was great that she identified those things, but then needed a little basket in which 3 themes went, and then those themes went there, and those themes went there, but they were kind of connected by this broader thing, and they'll be part of my one chapter. Okay? So each of you will be different. Sometimes you've got this huge amount of data that you're breaking down into smaller ones, and you're so successful into breaking it down into smaller ones that you kind of got to regroup them together into bigger ones again, but probably different bigger ones than the ones you started, because it's just a huge amount of data. That is the process. Identifying themes, separating them, sequencing them, linking them together to make a coherent order. Okay. So, do you need to break down your things into smaller groups or work them up into bigger groups? It all depends how many you're finding and how you're identifying that process of connections. And then you separate and sequence them. If I've got these things, do I map that in that order? That order? Does it make a difference? Should it make a difference? Can you connect them together in a more straightforward way? You have in one way or another way. Okay. So, to go back to if one was doing a survey about hypothesis testing about voting in Newport, then actually a more thematic structure of that would be, okay, I was looking at the major factors that affect differences in young people voting in local elections in Newport. I've created all these little themes. One theme would be gender. One theme might be my parents' attitudes. A subsequent thing might be about what my friends did, how I was influenced by social media, what key issues of the day, what big themes are underneath that, and how actually familial pressure, i.e. parents, siblings, boyfriend, girlfriend, etc. You might group under one big category, and there's little things like parents first, siblings, partners, etc. How it influenced how I voted. You can see how those tree diagrams might be completely different from the next person, all dealing with the same data, but still creating a coherent narrative that allows you to, step by step, walk through this huge amount of data that you've generated. Okay? This is kind of working? Okay, so, to kind of summarise therefore, managing your data, dealing with it, you sift, you sort, you scope, what's relevant, what's most relevant, how does that point connect to the next point, how can I create themes and then order those themes to create a narrative. You are the tour guide, you are the person, you are the expert, you are the authority, you're the author of the thesis and the authority in terms of the person with the most expertise on this subject, and you are going to use your power to say, we're going to go here, we're going to go here, and then we're going to go here, and this is why. This is how the literature informs those things, and this is the argument. I'm going to end up with something big and important to say right at the end. So we've identified themes, we are ordering them in a particular way, and then we connect them. Connect them back to your questions. Connect them back to the literature review. What did the literature review say about that point, about voting patterns in Newport, or about veganism, or about vegetarianism? Does your data challenge those ideas? Does your data agree with those ideas, in your view? In what ways? How? Explain it to me. Point it out. Don't just leave it there for me to make the connections between. But if you think what Billy Bob said about veganism was really similar to what Brown 2015 said about veganism, then you make that connection. So what do you think? Well, John, everybody's going to do that. It's obvious, it's almost using the same words. It's almost though he's read the book. I almost don't care. I want you to point that out. The reader wants you to point that out for me, because what you think is normal, what you think is common sense, what you think is obvious, isn't obvious to the person sitting next to you. The lenses which with you look at that data and you think, well, that's just like what that person was saying about this, or isn't that amazing? Or that it's a complete challenge to what that person was saying about veganism. People aren't supposed to do this. You make that connection. You make your point, you connect it to the literature, and then you connect it either back to say what was going on here, or what the next person said, or was that person an outlier? Was that person just a crazy loon who didn't want to talk? Whatever. You make those points. You tell the reader what you think, because that's where you add value. Okay? On that point, you're adding value by your ability. When you get to this process of writing your empirics, you might suddenly have a kind of like, oh my god, style moment when you realise what it is you've been doing for the last few months, right? Because you've generated a question, you've read lots of stuff about it, you've chosen the right method, you've gone out and generated all this data, and then you're suddenly dealing with the things that you've been party to giving birth to, right? And you're kind of going, wow, through making these connections, saying, well, this is something that didn't exist before. This is not just simply a normal essay, although I've been saying throughout this module that this is just like compiling lots of different essays. It kind of is like that, but it's kind of, slightly more profound than that. You are deciding how to create themes in your tree diagrams, for the sake of argument. You're deciding how this mountain of data is going to be sorted. Then you are deciding how you're going to order them. Before that, you decided how you're going to collect the data, what's the appropriate methods. Before that, you decided what literatures inform it. Before that, you decided what questions you thought were important to ask. And then you roll all these things out. This is where you're harvesting your crop. This is where you're getting all that data, and you're thinking, wow, I've made all these decisions. If I've made good decisions all the way through, then this should be really good data. And then I'm just deciding how to present it to people, and how you decide to scope it, to sift it, to sort it, and at this point here, to connect it back. You're going, wow, how an individual piece of work this is going to be. All the different strengths and skills and moments of learning that you've had throughout your undergraduate career have kind of led to this. I'm creating this kind of brand new argument here. This is fantastic. This should excite you. This is like, I think this is really cool stuff. You know, it's getting this is you on a piece of paper. It's kind of brilliant. Okay, so connect the data. You've got these themes. How do they feed back to your literature reviews? How do they feed back to those big things that you thought was significant in your, this is why you did it in the first place, to the other ideas you've had on the topic, those things that are presented in a lit review. Create this callback, this conversation through your writing. All this is the process of translating and interpreting your data. From the get-go, if you've been thinking, it's really difficult to be critically analytical, everyone keeps saying, oh, you've got to be analytical, I have to present, I have to describe stuff. I'm sorry. You've not been doing that. From the moment you started your dissertation, as I've just alluded to, you have been being critical. You've decided what questions to ask and what questions not to ask. You decided what subject to focus on and what subjects not to focus on. And you had reasons for that. You decided on what literatures to involve and not to involve. You decided on what methods to involve and not to involve. This is just an extension of that process. You've been deciding which bit I should transcribe and which not to transcribe, which order to put this in, what emphasis to give to this stuff, which bits to explain and connect back to literature. This is all this process of translating your data, interpreting your data. This has been the process of analysing your data, of making informed, discerning decisions and backing them up. That is what being an undergrad and being an academic is all about. That's a really good question, Harry, because if you take it in the spirit of what I've just said, it's completely that. Actually, you've hit upon the thing where actually it's rather arbitrary, saying, well, what's secondary data and what's literature review? Right, because actually your literature review, you have been making critical decisions about what to include and what not to include. And to be honest, it's almost like an etiquette of dissertation writing. That is saying, okay, this is the knowledge that's out there, and that's what I am starting from, but I'm developing, right? And so as a consequence of that, you can probably see the utility of separating that out from what we deem to be our primary or the new knowledge that we're forming. So even that, let's sake of argument, say 2,000 words that you've written in your lit review about the concepts, the theories, all that sort of stuff, if you introduce them for the first time in your empirical data, that will be quite hard for the reader to take it all on board at once. So here's what this stuff, and that reminds me of something that I haven't told you about yet, but it's what Percy said all about vegetarianism, or whatever it happens to be. You go, okay, so I'm dealing with that new, and I'm dealing with that new, and I'm trying to make sense of it all. It makes sense for your reader, and it makes sense to write it as well, because that'd be very difficult for you to do all at once, is to separate it out. And so we are, I hesitate to say arbitrary, but there is a degree of arbitrariness about it. It's saying, okay, let's, in the literary form that is the dissertation, let's make an informed decision about how this is going to look like. Let's separate it out like this, simply for ease of doing it. Okay? Because the complex reality out there is so complex and chaotic that effectively you could just go, look, there's the world, deal with that, reader. Okay, we're trying to simplify it in a way to make a degree of sense. But you're dead right in that when what the marker is doing when they're looking at your literature review is effectively judging your critical analytical skills, identifying appropriate literature, dealing with it in a certain way, putting it in appropriate order, effectively the same sort of skills that I've been going on this morning about what you're doing with your empirical data. You're dealing with your empirical data, if this works for you, in the same way that you dealt with your literature review. You've got this whole mass of stuff. What are my key themes? In what order? How can I make a logical argument for them? You look at it like that, you're going, well, this is not news, I've done this once already. I'm just doing it with a different type of data. And creating the connections back. So importantly, if you've got, let's say, a 2,000 word lit review, you've done the heavy lifting there. So when you almost cite a source, you say, you know, Brown 2015 said this about vegetarianism, look how it connects. You don't have to explain Brown all again, you just have to note him, right, or her. And then you do your explanation, your connection, your value-added discussion there. Okay? It almost makes this bit easier by having done that already. Okay? But yeah, really good point. So all these processes that we've been talking about today in terms of your empirical stuff is not that dissimilar from what you've been doing already for the review of method and the review of literature. You're effectively helping the reader plot a course through all the stuff that you've been wading through, so it's easier for them than it was for you. Right? Helping the reader inform what you found and indeed what it means. What's its significance? Because that's where you're ending up in terms of writing your conclusion, but also writing your introduction and you're setting it up, which is what we'll talk about in the last formal lecture of this module, and we'll get to that in a moment. So, okay. So, I'm kind of thinking that you're on this, but let's just spend a few minutes doing this, just to remind you, because it might be useful for this, but also for assessment as well. So here's a quotation from Kirsty Hobson's work, actually. And when she was looking at some interviews, she's done interviews with people about their mobile phones, and she's transcribed a quotation. This is a quotation that she thought was interesting and significant, and you might have your equivalents of this for your empirical chapters. How do you present it? How do you put it into the very fabric of that chapter? So, this is what she's suggesting. Okay, so this is the quotation. I don't really know or looked into it really where things come from. I know that it's not easy to figure out where things come from. I do worry about that, and I need to be more sustainable about smaller things. But when it comes to things like electronics, it's a bit harder to keep up to date with what you want and to get something powerful enough. You have to go a bit further to get that. With things like food and clothes, I tend to keep that fairly sustainable. Okay. So, one option would be that you could just present that plonk in the data. This is what John said when I asked him about the social and environmental impacts of the mobile phone. So far, so all right. What does it tell the reader? It tells the reader that you've interviewed somebody, that you've identified a meaningful quote, you put it in a certain order. But you can do so much more. And this is where you come to the table, both in your essays and your dissertation. Begin identifying what might be interesting or significant or important about that quotation. Does anyone want to be brave and just shout something that you think is interesting or important or significant about this quotation? Well, the first, if you can just take it kind of line by line, and this might be a useful exercise to do. Take it for your own quotation. Take it line by line. Is there something of significance in that line? So I don't really know, or I haven't looked into, really, where things come from. I know it's not that easy to figure out where things come from. Is there any significance in that quotation? Anything of interest? So he's saying he's got a degree of ignorance. He doesn't really know the environmental, the social origins of his mobile phone. And he's also saying it's not that easy to find out where things come from. Okay? Is that him defending himself, rationalising his lack of knowledge? Do we agree with him? Do we think that it's quite difficult to find out the origins of the things that we are? Actually, in here I could probably find out straight away where things come from just by looking at the label. The problem is I probably haven't bothered because it's not that important to me. I've got other more significant things in my life. So it's pointing to the degree to which actually where we buy stuff, how we source things, we're more interested in how things look or their functionality, all that sort of stuff, or worrying about their environment and social impact. So far so normal. But it's worth us just acknowledging that normal, okay? Because it's important to the subject matter at hand. So I've just said, I don't know, 20 seconds of words about the first bit of that quotation, right? And you're thinking, okay, your equivalent quotation. Is there something worth pointing out on that? Okay, so we'll hold that in our heads. One thing you can say about the first sentence. I do worry about that. I need to be more sustainable about smaller things. But electronics in particular, it's a bit harder to keep up to date with what you want and get something that actually is kind of functional, is powerful enough, and all that sort of stuff. So, the saying that actually, well, there's an emotional response to that lack of knowledge or that lack of interest. He worries about it. It gives him anxiety. To a great degree or a small degree, it's worth pointing out that it's there. But actually, getting a powerful enough computer to do the things that you need to do, from social media through to data analysis, etc., is really important. And kind of life expects that. Life has been generated in a certain way that actually you just can't sit in a lecture room like this. You can't, you're the anomaly that without a laptop in front of you, we all kind of got one. Life's kind of been created that way. That's not down to the individual. That's down to the broader societal structure. What a lot of stuff to bring out of the second sentence. And then you have to go a bit further than that with food, like foods and clothes. I tend to keep that fairly sustainable. So in terms of electronics is one thing, food, clothing, big areas of study, might be some other things. So, as Kirsty kind of outlines, there are apparently one quotation. I could just leave it there in my analysis and let the reader do some work on it, but is the reader expected to do the work, or are you expected to do the work? You expect to go, okay, to you what is significant in that quotation? There might be other stuff in there that you think, why is he overlooking that? That's really important. Precisely. That's what you bring to it. That's how your mindset and all the stuff that you've absorbed through your undergraduate career and the connections, ding, 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 that you're making to that module or that thing you read or that thing from the media or that thing from, Instagram feed or whatever. They're making those connections. That's what you should be doing. So, from Kirsty's point of view, it's important things are which bits of knowledge, where does good knowledge come from? How do you get to know where your stuff comes from? And what trade-offs people make between the necessity, what their wants, their needs, their environmental impact, the functional aspect of it, and how does he defend his situation? Because actually, through the process of talking about it to Kirsty, he might have gone, oh, I shouldn't have done that. And he's got to kind of work out that there's a difference, as a disjuncture, between his aspiration and what he actually does. Now, I'm kind of thinking you have a choice. So, point number one, this is what you need to do for your quotations or your data. Add that value. Identify what you think is important. And of course, you. And you should give yourselves all credit. That's what you've been doing in every essay you've ever written. Okay, you don't just present a quotation and move on. You present a quotation and you engage with it and tell the reader why it's important. Okay? The thing that I started off saying about that was actually, that's quite a big quotation too. If there's that big quotation and there's 3 or 4 points that you could make from it, do you want to present it as one quotation? Or actually, it's this process of sifting, of identifying key themes. Could that be split up into 3 key themes, and you split the quotation up into where the punctuation stops, and say, actually, I want to talk about the last bit first. So I want to talk about foods and clothes, and then I want to introduce that bit and that bit. And actually, I want to talk about that bit, but not here. I want to talk about that bit in my next chapter. So you can, again, it's this process of identifying, do you want a big chunky quote, a smaller quote, lots of little smaller quotes linked together because they're all on the same subject, and then deal with the discussion about that subject in the paragraph that follows. This is where you can do it in your own sweet way. Okay? And you can also, because I'm not sure which slide this comes up on, but I'm going to say it now. And in that authority, in that agency that you have, you get to decide what things are most important and what things are not important. Of course you are influenced by the literature. Of course you are influenced by your respondents. You shouldn't be, when someone said, I think this is really important, and you go, I dismiss that point entirely, because I don't agree. Of course you bring that in, and you say, these people are important, these ideas are important. But similarly, there might be something that's just mentioned by one respondent in your survey, or something that's just mentioned by one respondent in your interview, but to you, that's the thing that unlocks everything. That's like that's like the gold dust. You're thinking, okay, well, although one person said it, I can still talk about that a lot, because to you, it's really significant. So again, you're the person who can shine a light on a little nugget in your data because you think it's tremendously significant. And even just because one other person thought it was tremendously significant, it's something you can still spend some time discussing. Okay, I've done that. So, it's kind of connected. You don't necessarily have to transcribe everything. You don't necessarily have to talk about every single point that came up in your interviews or your focus groups or your surveys. You get to decide. You get to create the narrative. You get to create the things that you think are most important. If you think, actually, this arc of my narrative really works, but I haven't talked about that or this, do I need to? Because if I do, then everything... If those things directly relevant to your question, then yes, you need to talk about them. But if you're deciding, actually, no, my questions will become more about this, then you might want to note them in a footnote or an appendix, or you might want to leave them out entirely. That is completely fine. Okay? Not all the themes and sub-themes are going to make it into your final analysis. It's not a bad thing to scope out some materials. In fact, as we've argued, you've been doing that since the moment you started your dissertation, by not asking some questions and asking other questions. That point that I've just referred to, you get to present those key themes. You're deciding what those key themes are, how they emerge through your empirical material, because they are statistically significant, or simply because the emphasis, or it's not a thing, but in that moment of interview, someone would go, I really think this is important. And they went red, and they started sweating, and they wet themselves, and everything. It was so significant. But when it's written on a page, you go, I think this is really, really important. How on earth do you get across that it was so important to that person? You might put it in kind of square brackets. This person was almost hyperventilating at this moment. Or you can do that through your explanation about it. You get to add that value, add that emphasis, because you guys are the expert on this subject. Okay, and it all comes down to basically, how does it help you address your research questions? Answer the things you're going to do. Okay. So, I talked earlier on about linking stuff together, and this is just an example. Not an example about how you might kind of go through and reflect on a quotation, but how you might link different sources of data together instead of just present something and analyse it in a different chapter. This is kind of stuff that you've been doing again throughout all your essays. So, you could say, in my head, there's another slide there. So, you could say, Table 1.4 shows that 15% more females than males reported in the question survey that they strongly feel they are unsafe. You could leave it there, a presentation on a fact from a survey. You then say, okay, I don't want to just put my surveys there and then I want to connect it back to an interview. Yes, at that point in my head, it connects to what Helen said. Helen said, I don't like staying out late, even with friends. We tend to leave before it just gets too rowdy. Say 1:30 in the morning. After 2 a.m. it gets a bit leery, and I don't feel safe. Okay? That's an interesting point looking at this. Helen said, interviewee 1. Well, is that interviewee 1 said? Actually, that's a problem with anonymity, isn't it? Unless that's a pseudonym. Okay. And then, so you've got a survey fact, interview transcript. This supports O'Connell's assertion that even though males are more likely to be victims of violence, it is females who are more likely to feel unsafe. Survey, interview, literature review, connecting it together in a important conversation that you have decided how to do that. Okay. So, to summarise, don't just simply produce those long quotations without explanation or comment. Do not make a comment about something that you haven't got a quotation or a survey statistic or something to back up, i.e. evidence your point. So rather than several people said that when they went to a farmer's market, so they often went to a farmer's market, although some said they had been once or had never been at all, a more thorough approach might be several people said they often went to a farmer's market. Jim explained that he went every weekend. I don't think I've missed one this year, even if I had a bad cold. However, some respondents say they've been once or never at all. I once went to see what it was about, but to tell you the truth, it's cheaper going to Sainsbury's and parking's better too. And from that, so we're linking together different points, and from that I think, well actually, why is the parking better? Why is the parking better at Sainsbury's? Where is it going? You know, that point you could beget the next point, and the next point could follow quite logically from that because of what's part of that thing. Okay. So, to go back to those 3 bullet points we looked right at the beginning, so there's lots of ways of structuring your dissertation. I think what I've been trying to suggest in those last 2 slides is that multi-dimensional analysis, i.e. connecting together your surveys or your interviews or the thing in the lit review, is much better than simply, here's what my survey said, here's what my interviews say, and now I'm going to offer some comment on it. If you can connect them together, it just works so much better. Okay? So avoid that one-dimensional analysis. Try not to simply describe each piece of data one at a time. It's better to bundle them together. Okay. So, last couple of slides. Some of the common problems people fall into when they're attempting this process of translating that huge raw data into a rational, reasoned argument is that they make poor decisions on that interpretation and that translation of data. They make poor analytical decisions. Either simply they've just done the wrong test. If they're going to do a chi-squared test and they've just done it incorrectly, okay, that's something that you can straightforwardly avoid with a bit of advice. Okay, trying to do percentage analysis from 6 interviews. Your number of n is not big enough, so don't do it. You need a different type of procedural analysis for surveys than you need differently from interviews. If the course that you're plotting through that analysis is actually veering away from the original point of your thesis. Now, it's kind of fine if, in your analysis, you end up somewhere that you didn't think you were going to end up. Indeed, that's kind of the beauty of it. But in that situation, you need to go back and retrofit your questions and realign your questions with where your narrative is going. Okay? And that's completely fine too. That's part of the process. But you can't have a misalignment between this thesis is going to find out about this, and I've ended up finding out about something completely different. Okay? You have to create a story that makes sense. And even if you can explain your introduction, I thought it was going to be about this and it ended up being about this, but wow, what if this turned out to be? Okay? Or you can just hush it up and not reveal to the reader that you effectively changed course halfway through. Same subject, but just asking different types of questions. Because things change, you improvise around your data. That's kind of the point. If you knew what you knew halfway through when you began, then it would have, of course, been different, and now you do, so make it different. Okay. Another common problem relates to how that theory connects back to your analysis, i.e., is there an alignment between the stuff you're talking about in your theory and the stuff you're talking about in analysis, or indeed you're not making those connections strongly enough. You're presenting it not as a bundled, together, connected narrative, but simply disparate points that have no sense of that they are creating that conversation between literature and analysis. There is there's no connection, there's no conversation, there's no value added that you're bringing to it. And the final one, the lack of depth in the data or analysis. That's simply coming from the fact that you haven't generated enough primary or secondary data. A lot of these faults will have been processed out by the good decisions that you've made up until this point. Okay. I don't need to go through these points. I've been making them all the way through. have a sense of direction. For me, it comes down to these 3 points. In all the decisions that you've made, in all the analysis that you're doing, in all the translation, interpretation you're doing, from the point of which when you started this thesis right up to now, try to have clarity. Be as precise and be as explicit as you can. If we were breaking down that quotation about mobile phones, take each sentence in turn and try to be really clear about why you think that is important. And sometimes you might think of it's important for 2 reasons. Well, if it's important for 2 reasons, as you're working through, as you're typing this up, because that's how we work, that's how we think. We type, we write, we think, we type, we write, we think. We don't arrive at our piece of paper or our PC knowing what it is we're going to say. We're working it out as we go. Well, if you work it actually, no, there's 2 points here, then split those points up. 1 sentence, 1 point. So I'm as clear and I'm as clear and it's explicit and precise as I can be. For each of those things, can I connect it? Can I evidence it? If you think that's an important point, yeah, it's not just me who thinks that, but that person in my lit review thinks that too. Make that connection. Back it up with evidence. Don't say something that you don't assert, argue. Okay? Back it up. And then, something I've just touched upon, but in terms of those themes, in terms of those nodes, in terms of those tree diagrams, etc., separate and sequence your points. 1 point, 1 sentence. As you've seen today, when I start off something and think, oh crikey, no, there's 2 things there, and come back and say it again, because it's not going to be that clear if I try and bundle 2 points into 1 sentence. It's the same with our writing, okay? That's why the drafting process is so important. Although you can break this rule, it's worthwhile considering it as a rule. But 1 sentence, make 1 point in 1 sentence. Next point, make next sentence. Putting 2 points together in 1 sentence, it just becomes cluttered. Unless you're a super fine writer, it's very difficult for the reader to follow your logic. So, clarity, evidence, separate and sequence your points. If you do that well, the empirical analysis will go really smoothly. Okay. So, manage your data, describe, be clear and precise and concise about your points, and connect things together. So that's where we're at. To remind you about where we started, I suppose, in issues of supervision. Everybody's got the same amount of supervision. Some of you are getting it in different ways, in different chunks, doing different things, and that's completely fine. But both staff and yourselves as students know you have about 8 hours, more or less, to use. It's very difficult to stockpile that time to think, okay, where are we at in the semester? What have you used? What can you expect from your supervisor in the time that's coming forward? And if there are any problems of any nature at all, stop behind afterwards, let's discuss them. Okay, because good communication is vital to make sure you get the support that you need. This is where we're at in the semester. I say we're up to kind of week 5. Next week is reading week. So we are due to have 2 more sessions as part of this module, okay? In week 8 and week 9. In week 9, I'll talk about the introduction and conclusion chapters. Okay, so that'll be more formally a lecture, if you like, but I will give over time to any time for collective Q&A or individual Q&A, however you need it, okay? In week 8, I wasn't necessarily planning to deliver anything, okay? But I'd be in here, and we can either just do a formal Q&A, or you can tell me over the next couple of weeks anything that you want covered or recovered, okay? And I'll generate the material to deliver that for you, okay? So can we say that perhaps by the end of week 7, if I put this in an email through Learning Central to everybody, then you'll email